Della Sterling was 23 years old and had been told her presence was no longer required in the only house she had ever known. It is a peculiar, hollow feeling to be standing on a granite ridge in Nevada County, California, looking at the blue-tinged peaks of the Sierra Nevadas you have memorized since childhood, only to realize that no part of the earth beneath your boots belongs to you anymore. She stood there with exactly $10 tucked into the watch pocket of her denim pants and a heavy steel tuning iron, a tool for finding the harmonic resonance of molten brass, resting in her rucksack like a heavy secret. She spent those final $10 on an abandoned, soot-stained red brick fire station standing at the end of a long, dead logging road, a structure that had been forgotten by the Forestry Service and the maps alike. But what nobody in the valley knew, and what the people who cast her out could never have guessed, was that inside the massive, square, hose-drying tower in the center of that silent station was a mechanical secret that shouldn't exist, something that would change her life and the industrial heritage of the mountains forever. Before we continue, if stories like this, stories of the things we find when we have nothing left, mean something to you, hit subscribe. It helps us keep these legacy road stories alive, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the miles. Della's story didn't start with the eviction notice or the cold, biting wind on the ridge. It didn't start with the harsh words of an uncle who decided he needed her room more than she needed a future. It started in the rhythmic, sulfur-scented, amber-lit atmosphere of her grandmother's foundry. Her grandmother, Beatrice Sterling, was the last true master of the ringing brass. Beatrice didn't just cast tools. She performed what she called the balancing of the alloy. She believed, with a fierce, quiet conviction, that a community was only as safe as the bells it rang, to warn its neighbors, and that the act of pouring a fire bell was the highest form of maintaining the peace of the valley. The Sterling lineage was tied to the copper and tin of the California mountains by the bells they cast and the heavy iron flasks they used to translate the history of the world into a series of clear, resonant tones. The lineage stretched back through 7 generations of calloused hands and steady hearts, beginning with an ancestor named Malachi Sterling, who had crossed the mountains in the mid-1800s with nothing but a set of precision clay molds and a recipe for ever-still bronze that required no chemical and a perfect ear for the shimmer of the melt. He understood the physics of the sound, how to marry a human warning to a copper skin using nothing but the temperature of the crucible and the strength of a rhythmic pulse. No shortcuts were allowed in a Sterling foundry. No modern computer-balanced alloys were permitted to cheat the surface of the chime. It was a trade of absolute integrity. Beatrice had been Malachi's great-great-granddaughter, and she had practiced that trade for 65 years, her ears eventually becoming as sharp as the iron clappers she forged. When Della was 5 years old, the real lessons began. Beatrice didn't believe in toys, and she certainly didn't believe in distraction. She believed in the knowing of the poor. She would sit Della down on a low, 3-legged stool near the furnace, a place where the air was always thick with the sweet metallic scent of warm copper and the sharp, clean smell of river sand. Beatrice would hand her a handful of tiny, discarded brass filings, heavy for their size and perfectly gold, and tell her to close her eyes. She told her that the eyes were a founder's second tool, but the skin was the first. She taught her that the metal was a living nerve, and that every hum of a cooling bell was a heartbeat in a body that stretched from the valley floor to the highest peak. She explained that when the temperature of a furnace reaches 2,000 degrees, it creates a specific frequency, a vibration that a Sterling could feel in the marrow of her bones. This wasn't magic. It was the accumulation of 2 centuries of listening. Beatrice would place a heavy iron ingot on the table and have Della rest her palm on it over and over until she could hear the difference between a metal that was hungry for tin and a metal that was true just by the song of the raw material. "The world wants you to look with your eyes first, Della," Beatrice would say, her voice sounding like the very resonance of a church bell. But the eyes are easily fooled by a shiny polish or a bright flame. The eyes want to see the finished bell before the metal has even felt the fire. You have to look with your skin. You have to feel the shimmer of the meld. If the heat is blue and jittery, the metal is anxious and there is a crack coming that will ruin the tone. If the heat is fat and orange, the air is heavy and the chime will struggle to reach the next ridge. You find the shimmer, and you find the strength of the community. You find the peace in the pitch. A bell that doesn't reach its home is a voice that is lost in the woods, child. Never forget that the copper remembers the hand that poured it. By age 6, Della's primary job was the sorting of the grit. It was a task that required the kind of patience most adults have forgotten in the age of instant gratification. She would spend hours at her grandmother's feet separating the fine-grained, silty sand from the coarse seconds and the clinkers, the rocky impurities, from the prime structural casting sand used for the bell mold. Della learned that every single grain of sand had a memory. She learned that the river sand held the history of the high-speed currents, making it fast enough for a smooth surface, while the mountain sand held the memory of the heavy rock crush, making it strong enough for the long-haul castings. She learned that to disrespect the sand was to disrespect the fire captain, who would eventually trust his life to the alarm. By age 8, Della was finally allowed to assist with the tamping. This was the most physically demanding and spiritually significant part of the founders' work. They used a set of hand-forged brass sand rammers, two heavy tools that fit together perfectly to ensure the sand required exactly the right amount of density to hold the molten brass. Della would stand on a wooden box, her job being to use a small wooden mallet to strike the rammer while Beatrice tested the surface. The rhythm had to be exact. Too much tension, and the gas would be trapped, causing the bell to explode in the mold. Too little, and the metal would leak through the sand, creating a rough, ugly surface that would never ring true. The sand would hum as it tightened, a deep, rhythmic vibration that Della could feel in her elbows and her chest. "The tension is the truth, child," Beatrice whispered during those long, focused sessions. "If your mind is wandering, the sand will be mushy. If your heart is angry, you'll pack the walls too tight. You have to be as steady as the granite under this station. We don't make bells that are temporary, we make ones that are enduring. Every strike of the mallet is a promise that the warning will find its way home. We are building the sanctuary of sound before the fire even starts. A founder who doesn't respect the grit is a person who has already lost the meaning." At age 10, the curriculum shifted to the art of the silent strike. This was the most delicate part of the trade, involving the use of tuning forks and harmonic iron to test a bell without ever actually ringing it. Della would watch as Beatrice used a tuning iron to find the strike tone and the hum tone of a cooling bell. Beatrice taught her how to read the drift, the subtle shift in the bell's pitch that occurred as it cooled from white heat to room temperature. She taught her that the world was not a silent thing, but a constant conversation of energy. "The drift is the doubt," Beatrice would say. "If you ignore it, the chime will be a ghost of the truth. You have to account for the metal's own memory of being a liquid until the skin can breathe. The foundry is a mirror for the soul. If you aren't honest with your alloys, your life won't be either. You must know the shape of the silence before you can know the shape of the alarm." By age 12, Della was sent out into the old mining camps alone. Her task was to search for the specific materials the trade required. Bell copper, which were the heavy wires and fittings from the 19th century mines that had been enriched by the mountain's own minerals. She learned to identify the copper by the way it caught the light in the high Sierra grass. She learned how to use a metal scribe with such precision that she could mark a true bar without hurting the metal's internal crystal structure. She learned that a station's beauty wasn't in its red paint, but in the honesty of its alarm bell. By age 14, she was entrusted with the heat check, This was the difficult art of determining the pour point of the bronze using only her own pulse and a graphite rod. If the metal was off by even 20 degrees, it would be too thick to fill the letters of the founder's name on the bell's rim. Della learned to move with a stillness that matched the surface of the molten brass. She learned that any hesitation in the hand was a danger to the souls in the valley. She learned that the degree wasn't just a measurement, it was a marriage of separate moments into a single, safe reality. Beatrice used to tell her stories during the long, humid afternoons while they sat on the porch, their fingers moving in a blur of cleaning the brass terminals with lemon and salt. She told her about the Great Fire of 1958. The flames had been so fierce they had melted the telephone lines, and the mountain towns had been cut off, their only hope being the sound of the Sterling bells echoing through the canyons. People stopped believing in the rescue that year, Beatrice said, her hands never stopping their work on a bell clapper. But they didn't stop needing the sound. They brought me their melted belfries and their broken alarms, desperate for something that would tell them the world was still looking for them on the other side of the smoke. I spent a whole winter doing nothing but rebeating, taking the broken past and turning it into a resonant future. We kept the heartbeat of the county alive that year, Della. We showed the fire that we could still find the flow. Every bell I cast was a way of saying, "We are still here. We may be scorched, but we are not silenced. We were the only ones who knew how to find the frequency when the world went red." Then there was the story of the Sierra Station. Beatrice told her about a massive red brick building her own grandfather Malachi had built in 1895. It was meant to be the master signal hub for every volunteer crew in the Nevada foothills. But the modern sirens had arrived, and the station had been abandoned to the ivy and the mountain lions. Malachi had been a man of deep secrets and deeper math. "Malachi put a secret in that station," Beatrice would say, her eyes twinkling like the blue spark of a furnace. "He said that a chime is a lock, and the right rhythm is the key. He told me the station would wait for a Sterling who knew the value of a silent spark. He spent 3 years building the hose tower alone, and he never let anyone see the mechanism beneath the alarm bell. He said the signal is a private conversation between the founder and the forest." The teenage years were spent in deep, exhausting apprenticeship. Every Saturday morning, from the age of 15 to 18, was dedicated to a specific type of casting. 1 month it was core building, the difficult art of making the internal mold that creates the hollow space inside the bell. Another month it was clapper forging, which required a perfect synchronization of weight to ensure the bell didn't crack when struck. Della learned the chemistry of the trade, how to balance the copper and tin in a gravity pour to ensure the chime stayed constant, but hard enough to travel 20 miles. Beatrice was a hard teacher. If a bell wasn't cast with perfect resonance to within a millihertz, she would take a sledgehammer and break the bronze, letting the metal fall back into the scrap pile. "If you send a lie out into the world, it will eventually find its way back to you," Beatrice would say. A bell that rings flat is a lie, told to the person who has to trust it with their life. It tells them the founder was in a hurry. Start again. Feel the shimmer. Be honest with the strike. The relationship was one of quiet, shared labor. They would work for 6 or 7 hours without speaking, the only sound being the rhythmic tink-tink thud of the hammers and the whoosh of the furnace. Della grew to love that silence. It wasn't empty, it was full of the work. She learned that a person could say more with a well-timed strike on a tuning iron than they ever could with 1,000 words. She learned that her grandmother's love wasn't expressed in hugs, but in the sharpening of a terminal post and the demand for perfection. Beatrice passed away on a crisp, silent morning in late October, just as the frost was beginning to turn the hemlock needles to silver. Della found her in the foundry, her hand resting on a brass master mold for a station bell, her fingers still holding the tension of the last pour. She was 85 years old. She had outlived her husband, her siblings, and her own daughter, Della's mother. Beatrice had been the sun around which Della's entire world orbited. With her gone, the gravity of the mountains felt different. It felt like it was trying to push her off the land. Within a month of the funeral, the cast-out moment arrived. Della had been living on the family farm, which was technically owned by her step-uncle, a man who saw the Sterling heritage as a cluttered museum of scrap metal. He informed Della that the property was being sold to a developer who wanted to build luxury cabins for tourists. He gave Della 48 hours to pack her bags. He looked at the heavy brass bells and the bins of river sand with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You're 23, Della," the uncle had said, his voice flat and practical. "You can't spend your life playing with fire and dirt in a shed. The world is digital sensors and fire sprinklers now. There's no money in tradition. I'm giving you 2 days to clear out. I've already signed the papers and the equipment is being scrapped for the copper value. You should go find a real job in the city. Maybe you can work at a security company." Della left with her canvas rucksack, her steel tuning iron, her grandmother's favorite clapper hammer, and $10 she had found tucked into the back of Beatrice's favorite ledger, the Malachi Sterling Station blueprints from 1895. She had nowhere to go, no car, and no plan. She spent 3 nights sleeping in a laundromat in Grass Valley, her fingers tracing the edge of her tuning iron by the light of a flickering neon sign. The cold seep of the mountain air was a constant reminder of her new reality. She felt like a pulse that had been sent out and then left to decay into silence, waiting for the echo to find her again. She felt like the world was a vast network and she was the only station without power. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making legacy road stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever felt like a silent history was calling you home, even when everything else was falling apart? Della was sitting in the corner of a small diner near the town square, trying to make a cup of black coffee last for 3 hours, when she overheard a conversation between 2 men in the booth behind her. They were talking about an old brick building that had been abandoned on a piece of state surplus land near the Yuba River. "That Sterling Station," one man said, shaking his head. "Been sitting there since the fire watch moved to the peak in the 60s. The county finally put it on the surplus list because it's a tax liability. $10 flat just to sign the deed and take the responsibility of the roof. Nobody wants it. It's more soot than brick, and the hose tower is a liability. It's a death trap of rotted timber and heavy brass." Della's heart didn't just beat, it surged. She knew the Sterling Station. It was the one Beatrice had told her about, the one Malachi had built. She walked the 8 miles to the county building in the fading afternoon light. The clerk was a man named Mr. Weaver, who looked as old and weathered as the river cobble himself. $10, kid," Weaver said, looking at her scuffed boots and the messy bun. "You pay the cash, you get the iron key, and you have the deed, but I'm telling you, that place is a graveyard of echoes. Nothing in there but rust and regret. You'll be the one responsible if that brass bell falls through the tower floorboards." Della handed over her final $10. Her hand didn't shake. She felt a strange, anchored certainty. Weaver handed her a heavy iron key and a stamped paper. The station was tucked into a deep mountain pass, overgrown with briars and shadowed by a dying walnut tree. It looked like a red brick fortress that had been petrified by time. She put the key in the heavy oak office door. It groaned, but it turned. She stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of old oil, damp stone, and something else. Something that smelled like Beatrice's foundry. The building was a cathedral of iron and light. Massive pine timbers rose up into the shadows of the belfry. But it was empty. The bays were empty, and the equipment was gone. As Della began to clear the debris from the central hose tower floor, moving with the rhythmic focus Beatrice had taught her, she noticed something strange about the massive alarm bell. It was a block of heavy cast bronze, 3 feet across, hanging from an iron yoke in the center of the tower. Resting on a stone plinth nearby was the station's original alarm hammer. It was missing its primary handle, but the head was built of the finest sterling steel Della had ever seen. Della remembered the riddle Beatrice had told her, that a chime is a lock. She pulled her grandmother's blueprints from her rucksack and looked at the diagram of the hose tower. There, hidden in the scrollwork of the bell's rim, was a tiny inscription. The brass must sing the all-clear ghost, or the tower remains a grave. Della realized that the tower wasn't locked with metal. It was locked with a specific series of harmonic vibrations. The floor of the hose tower was designed to carry a vibration directly into the internal counterweighted locks of the masonry. She took her steel tuning iron from her bag. She didn't have a power source, but she remembered Malachi's blueprints showed a series of acoustic pipes, hollow copper tubes buried in the masonry that connected the bell to the foundation. She spent the next 4 hours locating the harmonic sweet spot on the belfry floor, clearing the dust with her clapper hammer. She placed the base of her tuning iron against the stone. She stood in the belfry next to the bell. She took a deep breath. She struck the bell with her clapper hammer, tapping out the Sterling family all-clear code, a specific rhythmic sequence of strikes that translated to the sequence. Safe. The strikes were sharp and clean, the pure bronze-on-steel sound ringing through the silent station. Suddenly, a deep, sub-bass hum began to vibrate through the floor. A harmonic latch, triggered by the resonance of the all-clear note, clicked. The two primary locking bars inside the floorboards slid apart with a heavy, rhythmic thrum. A section of the hose tower floor, 4 feet square, began to rotate slowly on a central axis, acting as a counterweight. As it turned, a secondary pedestal, made of lead and cedar, rose up from the earth to take its place. Della stepped forward as the pedestal reached the floor. Inside the tower vault was a sanctuary Malachi Sterling had built to protect the soul of the trade. On a central shelf sat a heavy iron lockbox and a set of 12 lead-sealed Sterling crucibles, each one a masterpiece of refractory engineering, hand-carved with the Sterling star. These were Malachi's finest tools, designed to survive a 1,000-degree pour without cracking. But beside them was the real treasure, a collection of sealed glass jars containing the ever-still-founding flux, a specialized mixture for purifying molten brass that had been lost since the 1920s, made of bone ash and crushed ruby. Della opened the iron box first. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk, were stacks of gold coins, Liberty Head double eagles, dated between 1870 and 1910. She counted them slowly. There were 44 coins. At today's market value, it was over $22,000. But it was the object at the very bottom of the vault that made her breath catch. It was a map of the Sierra signal grid, a mechanical device made of brass and copper that tracked the acoustic carry and atmospheric health of every fire bell in the northern mountains. It was the Sterling Heart, the original blueprint for keeping the valley warned and safe. Tucked inside the map case was a folded letter, written in a bold, elegant script. To the Sterling who remembers the chime, the letter read, "My name is Thomas Sterling. I am the son who stayed to guard the station. I kept these tools and this gold safe because I knew the world would one day try to sell our safety for a profit. But a Sterling knows that a warning is not a commodity. It is a weight. These crucibles are the weight of our family's honor. The map is the voice of the mountain. I have kept them safe in this stone heart, waiting for the one who knows how to listen to a shimmer. The gold is for the station. The tools are for the trade. The map is for the future. Don't let the Sterling chime die. Find the note." Signed, Thomas Sterling, 1928. Della did not cry. She didn't let a single tear fall. Instead, she took her tuning iron and ran it along the edge of the first silver-mounted crucible. She felt the pulse of the history against her thumb, a rhythmic, metallic potential that had been waiting for her for nearly a century. A deep, rhythmic sigh of arrival escaped her lips. She took a small scrap of copper wire from her rucksack, the last piece of her grandmother's favorite furnace grate, and clutched it to her chest, the metal smelling of the foundry and the mountain. "I'm here, Uncle Thomas," she whispered into the silence of the station. "The chime won't stop. I promise you that." The next morning, Della walked back into the town of Nevada City. She didn't look like a girl who had been sleeping in a laundromat. She went to the bank first, her hands still smelling of the sulfur and the ancient lead. The teller's eyes went wide as Della laid out the gold coins, but the deed to the station and the letter provided the legal bridge she needed. After securing her deposit, she went to a small used car lot on the edge of town. She bought a 1988 white Toyota Hilux. It was a tough, indestructible truck with a long bed and a manual transmission. It had 200,000 miles on it, but the engine hummed with the same dependable rhythm as a well-calibrated bell. She paid $1,900 cash. It was the first thing she had ever owned that didn't belong to a grandmother's mercy or an uncle's whim. She felt a surge of pride as she shifted the gears, the Hilux rumbling to life with a steady mechanical sound. The restoration began immediately. Della moved her meager belongings into the base of the fire station office. The first month was spent entirely on the tower breath. She spent every daylight hour on the roof and the belfry, stripping 90 years of soot from the brickwork and replacing the rotted cedar shingles on the hose tower with new, hand-felled timber. She learned the specific voice of the station, how the bricks expanded with the heat, and how the iron tower resonated with the movement of the storms outside. She cleared the briars from the bays, revealing the original stone floor that Malachi had laid over a century ago. She wasn't alone for long. Word of the Sterling Girl and the working station spread through the hollows like the chime of a signal bell. A man named Silas, who ran the local hardware store and had been a friend of Beatrice's in the old days, stopped by the station one afternoon in his truck. He brought a crate of fresh apples and a gallon of high-grade copper cleaning solution. "Thomas was a ghost for a long time, Della," Silas said, leaning against the timber door frame and looking at the new timbers with a nod of approval. "He thought he could bury the chime, but a sterling is tied to the heat. I reckon he saw the trade in you even when you were just a toddler at Beatrice's feet. You're doing good work, child. This valley has been missing its heartbeat for a long time." Silas became a mentor and a recurring visitor. He helped Della source the specialized refractory clay she needed to repair the furnace, and showed her where the original copper plates were buried in the creek bed. Every Tuesday, Silas would stop by with a small gift, a jar of honey, a new set of precision rammers, or just the local news. His presence made the station feel like part of the world again, a thread tied back into the community. The homemaking was a slow, deliberate process of reclaiming her life. Della built a heavy founder's bench from reclaimed oak inside the station office, mirroring the one she had worked at in Beatrice's foundry. She installed a small cast-iron stove for warmth and for heating her casting sand. She scrubbed the brick walls with vinegar and salt, removing the smell of neglect until the scent of the cedar and the copper could breathe again. The first night Della spent in the station after the alarm bell was fully restored was the first night she truly slept in years. She listened to the slow, heavy thrum-thrum of the wind against the hose tower, the sound vibrating through the very stones of her bed. She was no longer a pulse cast aside. She was the founder herself. She felt the weight of the gold in the bank, and she felt the weight of the responsibility in her hands. She placed Beatrice's photograph on a small shelf she had carved from a piece of red cedar. She hung the sterling crucibles in a secure case above her bench, and she kept Thomas's letter tucked into the frame of the window so she could see his words every time the sun rose over the hills. She was no longer at the mercy of others. She was the architect of her own course. The restoration of the Sterling Heart maps was more than just physical labor. It was a sensory immersion into the heart of the Sterling heritage. Della spent hours each day in a specific rhythm. In the mornings, she would prepare the casting sand, the smell of the ammonia and lemon filling the office. Then she would spend the afternoon at the bench, the microscopic strokes of the silver pen turning under her watchful eye as she updated the resonance grid. She also began to experiment with her own ever-still flux, just as Silas had done. She gathered specialized minerals from the ridge to use in her refinement, and she spent nights studying the mechanical charts, her mind exploring the possibilities of harmonic founding. Her station became a gallery of bronze and cedar, the finished handbells gleaming on the shelves like captured light. In her second year, the business began to take shape. She got a commission from a high-end museum in Sacramento that had heard about the founder of the station. They commissioned her to restore a collection of 19th-century fire bells. She spent months on that order, her hands moving with a precision that surprised even her. She realized that the pull she felt in her hands was the same pull Malachi had written about, the strength to hold the note when the world wanted to accelerate. Community reputation began to spread by word of mouth. Neighbors would stop by with their old clocks and their confused electronics, asking if she could find the chime again. They would stay for a cup of coffee and a story, their voices filling the station with a warmth it hadn't known in 40 years. She charged a fair price for her work, not enough to be rich, but enough to live with dignity. It was a trade that commanded respect, and she was the one who held the key. One Saturday, an old volunteer fireman named Mr. Henderson brought in a small brass alarm bell that had been cast by Beatrice in 1950. The rim was cracked, but the sterling star on the base was still as clear as a bell. "Can you save it, Della?" he asked, his eyes searching Della's. Della spent 3 weeks carefully recasting the rim and treating the bronze, feeling Beatrice's original tension beneath her own fingers. It was a conversation across time, a handshake with a ghost. Mr. Henderson became a regular visitor, bringing elk jerky and news from the high fire lookouts. The station became a hub for the valley. People would come not just for bells, but for the sense of continuity that Della had restored. She began to host small workshops on the weekends, teaching the local children the basics of the trade of the poor. She wanted them to understand that their heritage wasn't just a digital coordinate. It was something they could hold in their hands and feel in their bones. She remembered a specific afternoon in the 3rd year. A young girl, no older than 7, was trying to sort the grit. Her small hands were struggling with the clinkers. Della sat down beside her and told her the story of the Great Fire of 1958. She saw the girl's eyes light up with the realization that she was part of something bigger than herself. In that moment, Della knew that Beatrice's legacy was safe. The chime would continue. The seasons in Nevada County have a way of anchoring a person to the earth. The winters are harsh and silent, the ridge buried in snow. Della spent those months in the station, the wood stove her only source of warmth and light. She would sit by the fire and draft new bell designs in the old sterling book, her mind constantly exploring the possibilities of the mountain energy. The summers are humid and vibrant, the air thick with the sound of cicadas and the smell of wild mint. She would gather her sand in the creek, the tall trees providing a canopy for her work. She also became a guardian of the valley's history. She worked with Silas to catalog the town's industrial collections, ensuring that the stories of the mountain families were preserved for future generations. She understood that her trade depended on the health of the memory, and she took that responsibility as seriously as a founder takes the balance of the chime. On a clear, copper-lit evening in the late October of her 4th year, Della sat on the stone threshold of her station. The white Toyota Hilux was parked in the clearing, loaded with finished bells for the Sacramento Museum. The smoke from her small stove rose straight into the still air, a signal of life and work in the deep hollow. She looked out at the horizon where she had stood 4 years ago, homeless and alone. The wind was still there, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a rhythm to be followed. The meditation on the trade had become her daily practice, her way of staying centered in a world that often moved too fast. She realized that the trade of the poor wasn't just a physical requirement for making a bell, it was a philosophy for living a meaningful life. To find the shimmer was to understand the natural texture of reality. To hold the tension was to remain steady in the face of change. To keep the chime was to ensure a future that had a pulse. She realized that Beatrice hadn't just been teaching her how to polish brass and pack sand, she had been teaching her a way of being in the world. She had been teaching her that a fire station is not a static object, but a living partnership between the founder and the mountains. That's the thing about the chimes our grandmothers teach us to find. We do not always know, when we are 6 years old and sorting grit on a workshop floor, that the sorting is, itself, the trade. We learn it slowly, strike by strike, pulse by pulse. We learn that the sanctuary is only as good as the spirit of the one who trued it. We learn that the beauty of a thing is in its function and the honesty of its construction. And then, years after the old woman dies, we strike a bell in a ruined station we bought for $10, and we understand what she had been teaching us all along. She had been teaching us that a bell does not just store warnings. It sets the intention for the grace. It tells the world that someone lived here, someone poured these things, and someone cared enough to keep them bright and steady against the darkness. It is an act of defiance against the silence of the world. She had been teaching us that the heartbeat isn't just in the body, it's in the copper. It's the will to keep the truth whole, to keep the doubt at bay, to make a promise with your hands that doesn't break for winter or mountain. Della Sterling was 23 years old and homeless on a shale ridge. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned fire station in Nevada County. She discovered that she wasn't just buying a ruin. She was reclaiming her soul and securing her place in the long line of chimekeepers. She was the founder now, and as long as she held the key and felt the shimmer, the Sterling name would never be taken by the silence. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a moment of peace today. Every story we tell is a tribute to the trades that built us and the heritage we carry forward in our legacy road stories. We make these for the people who truly listen, the ones who understand that the old ways still have a place in a fast world. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. See you on the next Legacy Road Tale.